Hey guys, tonight we begin with the medieval world, a place where half of everyday life was made up on the spot, and the other half was the result of someone forgetting to undo something they did 300 years earlier. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The medieval town crier was never intended to become a full-time profession. In theory, he was supposed to shout one message, just one, something urgent like, "The mill is on fire," or "Please stop throwing rotten fish at the tax collector." After that, he'd fade quietly back into the background as medieval people normally did. But medieval Europe had a fatal flaw. Almost nobody could read. A beautifully handwritten royal decree was basically decoration. The majority of the population looked at parchment the way a cow looks at a chessboard, with polite confusion. So towns improvised. They pointed at the loudest man they could find, handed him a bell and said, "Just yell everything for us." Temporary, simple, practical. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how a one-off emergency messenger became the medieval equivalent of a government-issued megaphone. The first time the crier made an announcement, people gathered immediately. Not because they cared what he said, but because noise attracted medieval peasants the way glowing screens attract us today. Once the town realized how efficient this was, literacy programs vanished faster than a loaf of bread during famine. Suddenly, the crier was responsible for every piece of public information. New laws, market days, missing livestock, incoming merchants, suspicious weather events. Please boil your water unless you enjoy illness. He didn't just break news. He broke silence permanently. He'd march into the marketplace at sunrise, medieval rush hour, ring a bell loud enough to make infants reconsider being born and shout, hear ye," which was medieval for, "Attention citizens, I am now ruining your morning," and people accepted it. They depended on it. The town crier was their news feed. Siri, emergency alert system, and neighborhood gossip rolled into one sleep-deprived human. Even when towns considered replacing him with posted notices, peasants protested. They didn't want to walk to a board. They didn't want to squint at uncomfortable scribbles, and they certainly didn't want to try reading while holding 12 potatoes and a chicken. So the temporary messenger got a uniform, a salary, legal authority, and job security so strong it could survive plagues, famines, and incompetent kings. Some families even turned it into a dynasty. Imagine inheriting the family business of being extremely loud. In the end, the town crier stayed for centuries because medieval Europe discovered a truth still relevant today. Why read when a man with a bell can yell it at you? The medieval world had a simple solution for losing things. Attach a bell to it. Livestock wandering off. Bell. Children wandering off. Bell. Nobles wanting everyone to know they existed. Absolutely. A bell. Several, actually. It all started innocently enough. Farmers put bells on cows so they wouldn't disappear into the forest and start a new life. Simple, sensible, temporary, just a small hack to keep track of wandering beef. But medieval Europe had a dangerous habit. Once something worked once, everyone adopted it immediately and never questioned it again. So bells spread like medieval fashion viruses. Soon goats had bells, sheep had bells, horses had bells. One chronicler even complains that he couldn't sleep because the night air did jingle most annoyingly. Congratulations, You've invented the world's first unwanted notification system. Then someone, likely a very tired parent, said the fateful words, "HM, what if we put a bell on the toddler?" And just like that, medieval child care improved by 20%. You always knew where the small human was, or at least which direction the jingling was fading toward. The problem, of course, came when the toddler realized the bell made noise and began running simply to hear it ring, forcing the parent into medieval interval training. But it didn't stop there. Oh no, nobles got involved. And nobles ruin everything by making it fashionable. They started attaching decorative bells to cloaks, boots, belts, hats, horse harnesses, and, in some cases, sleeves, because nothing says I'm important like jingling every time you move your elbow. By the late medieval period, the wealthy had turned themselves into mobile wind chimes. Walking into court sounded like someone shaking a bag of coins. Fashionable, maybe. Practical? Absolutely not. Imagine trying to sneak anywhere when you jingle like an overly dramatic house cat. And then came the jesters who took bells to their logical conclusion. If one bell is good, 2 bells are better. 27 bells are better. Every time a jester moved, entire ecosystems fled the area. Over time, bells became so normalized that people forgot they were originally a temporary tracking device. They became tradition, part of daily life, part of fashion, part of the soundscape of medieval towns, right up there with shouting merchants, squawking geese, and one guy coughing ominously in the corner. Bells stayed because medieval people discovered a truth modern parents deeply understand. If something moves and makes noise, at least you know where it is. Bread in medieval Europe wasn't just food. It was breakfast, lunch, dinner, political propaganda, an economic indicator, and occasionally a blunt object. Bread ruled everything. So when famine hit, kings and city councils scrambled to impose temporary bread laws, quick fixes to stabilize prices, prevent riots, and make it look like the government was doing something besides hunting and arguing about taxes. These laws were supposed to be short-term emergency measures, just a few rules to get through a bad harvest. A little don't charge people 12 chickens for a loaf kind of thing. Except medieval governments had the same weakness as modern ones. Once they make a law, they never remember to undo it. So the temporary bread laws stayed and became permanent fixtures of medieval life whether people liked it or not. The most famous example is England's assize of bread and ale, a rule created during food shortages saying bakers could not overcharge, underweight, or otherwise scam desperate customers. Sensible, temporary, helpful. And then the government said, actually, let's keep this forever until the end of time or until Britain invents supermarkets, whichever comes first. This single temporary law lasted over 600 years, far outliving the kings who wrote it, the bakers who hated it, and the peasants who pretended not to understand it. The law was so detailed it bordered on comedy. It regulated bread size, bread weight, bread price, what ingredients you could use, what ingredients you couldn't use, how drunk the ale merchant was allowed to be. Answer: not very. A baker could be fined, shamed, imprisoned, or thrown onto a medieval version of Yelp reviews if their loaf was even slightly too small. Forget burning down a village. That was practically negotiable. But selling a light loaf straight to jail. The bread police, yes, that was a real job, patrolled markets, weighing loaves like medieval personal trainers, checking for cheating. The tragedy, the famine ended. The shortages ended. But the bread laws were still there, breathing heavily over bakers' shoulders like an overprotective grandmother. Medieval people accepted it because tradition is stronger than logic, and because bread riots were terrifying. Angry mobs armed with stale loaves were not to be underestimated. So a temporary regulation intended to stop chaos became one of Europe's longest-lasting, most micromanaging laws. All because nobody wanted to say, "Hey, do we still need this?" Straw on tavern floors began as one of those charming medieval temporary ideas that should have lasted a single evening and then politely exited history. Some innkeeper preparing for a feast or festival scattered clean straw across the floor to absorb spilled ale, mask questionable smells, and give the place a rustic, cozy atmosphere. Guests loved it, or more accurately, they were too intoxicated to complain. The innkeeper woke up the next morning, surveyed the scene of destruction, and realized something miraculous. The straw had absorbed everything. The ale, the mud, the tears, the mysterious puddles that no one could identify. It was nature's medieval cleaning product. All he had to do was rake it up and replace it. Perfect short-term solution. But medieval innkeepers, being medieval, took this as a sign from heaven. If straw made cleanup easier once, why not? Always? Why not keep the floors permanently covered in something visitors couldn't see through, smell through, or judge too harshly? And so, a temporary decoration became a lifestyle choice. Soon, travelers expected taverns to have straw on the floor. If you entered a medieval inn and saw bare wood, something was terribly wrong. Either you had wandered into a noble establishment where they frowned upon fun, or the place had been recently robbed and the straw stolen for warmth. Straw became part of the tavern identity, as essential as the bar, the ale, and at least one man in the corner who definitely wasn't sleeping, just resting his eyes. Over time, the straw layer thickened. New straw was thrown on top of old straw. More drinks were spilled. More boots tracked in mud. More arguments ended in overturned tankards. Eventually, tavern floors developed geological layers like an archaeological site, each stratum telling the story of last night's questionable decisions. The smell did not improve, but medieval people were trained professionals in ignoring smells. Their homes smelled like smoke, livestock, sweat, and occasionally despair. A little tavern straw odor didn't even register on their olfactory scale. Even health inspectors in later centuries complained about tavern straw harboring fleas, spilled ale, and several life choices no broom could undo. But by then it was too late. Straw floors were tradition. You don't argue with tradition, especially not while standing in it. So what started as a one-night aesthetic choice became a continental habit that lingered for centuries. All because someone once said, just throw some straw on it. Castle kitchens, in theory, were supposed to be carefully planned. After all, the kitchen was one of the most dangerous places in any medieval stronghold. Open flames, boiling cauldrons, sharp knives, and cooks who had been awake since dawn plotting revenge against underseasoned meat. You'd think castle architects would design these spaces with precision. But medieval reality was flexible. Many castle kitchens began not with a blueprint, but with a crisis. Maybe the original kitchen burned down because medieval kitchens excelled at that. Maybe the castle was under siege and they needed to cook somewhere, anywhere that wasn't currently on fire. Maybe the Lord suddenly decided he needed a larger banquet hall for impressing guests, and the kitchen was rudely shoved aside like an unwanted stool. Whatever the reason, temporary kitchens popped up in the oddest places. A hallway? Sure. A spare chamber? Why not? A room directly next to the latrines. Absolutely disastrous, yet repeatedly chosen. The logic was always the same. We'll fix it later. Later never came. Once a temporary kitchen began functioning, castle life simply adapted around it. Servants memorized awkward new routes. Fire wardens prayed quietly. Architects pretended not to see what was happening, and cooks became experts in navigating spaces that defied every principle of human safety. In some castles, the temporary kitchen ended up nowhere near the dining hall. Servants had to carry trays of boiling stew across courtyards, down staircases, around defensive structures, and past livestock. A medieval obstacle course performed while holding soup. One misplaced step and dinner was cancelled, and someone was healing for 3 months. Other makeshift kitchens had ceilings so low that tall cooks worked permanently hunched, giving future historians the impression that medieval cooks were a separate evolutionary branch. Some setups lacked chimneys, so smoke simply filled whatever room was sacrificed. You can imagine how fun that was during lunch rush. But the strangest ones were the kitchens wedged into gatehouses or next to the castle's main entrance. Nothing says welcome to my fortress quite like being greeted by the smell of roasting meat and the loud swearing of overworked kitchen staff. Despite the chaos, people got used to it. Castle life flowed around these strange kitchen placements until they became accepted permanent features. The emergency improvisation solidified into architecture. And that truly is the medieval way. If it works today, that's good enough for the next 200 years. Medieval rulers loved making temporary laws. They issued them the way modern people send text messages frequently, impulsively, and without thinking about consequences. A king would wake up, hear that someone's goats had escaped again, create a decree on the spot, and declare, "This shall stand only until the crisis ends." But medieval crises never really ended, so neither did the laws. Take, for example, a temporary ban on selling fish on Sundays because the bishop was annoyed by market noise during sermons. This should have lasted a week, maybe 2. Somehow it became a regional law that lasted longer than the church building itself. Or imagine a rule forbidding citizens from walking around the castle after dark unless accompanied by a lantern and at least one sober adult. Introduced during a short-lived crime spike, it remained on the books for centuries. Future generations wondered whether medieval night air had once been dangerously unpredictable. The core problem was that medieval Europe lacked a delete button. Once a law was written down, it joined the ever-growing family of legal siblings crowding the margins of parchment scrolls. No one wanted to be the official who suggested abolishing an old law because what if it was still important? What if it offended a saint? What if it unleashed chaos or worse, bureaucracy? As time passed, these temporary laws accumulated into legal clutter. Historians digging through archives today still find bizarre rules like no pigs may enter the marketplace unless wearing a control rope or citizens shall not throw snowballs at soldiers. The fact that someone needed these laws is both hilarious and deeply concerning. Some laws became so outdated that people forgot why they existed at all. Villagers followed them simply because it's always been done that way, even when nobody remembered what it was. And if someone dared question it, elders would respond with the medieval equivalent of, "Don't ask questions, child. Tradition is tradition." The funniest part, medieval rulers occasionally tried to clean up the system by issuing new temporary laws to fix the old temporary laws, which quickly became additional permanent laws. Legal reform was like trying to extinguish a fire by throwing parchment at it. In the end, medieval Europe didn't just inherit traditions from its ancestors. It inherited centuries of spontaneously created regulations that refused to die. A temporary decree could disappear overnight, or it could haunt society until the Renaissance. You never knew which. The moat, that classic symbol of castle power and architectural drama, was not originally part of some grand master plan. Most medieval moats began as temporary ditches dug hastily during emergencies. Picture a worried noble pacing around his fortress, saying, "Dig something, anything. Just make it harder for enemies to walk toward us with knives." And so, peasants grabbed shovels and began creating Europe's future real estate aesthetic. These ditches were meant to slow attackers, not become permanent water hazards. Many weren't even filled with water at first. They were just glorified holes in the ground. But because medieval Europe adored turning accidents into tradition, lords began thinking, well, the ditch is already here. What if we keep it? Then someone had a truly groundbreaking idea. What if we fill it with water? This was followed by, where will we get the water? And then, I don't know, steal it from the river. Thus, moats were born, courtesy of improvisation, desperation, and mild hydrological theft. The moment a ditch got water, everything changed. Suddenly, the castle looked far more intimidating. Visitors saw it and thought, ah, yes, this lord is serious. He has a water hole. Never mind that the water was often murky, stagnant, and occasionally home to an ecosystem no biologist would dare approach. To medieval eyes, it screamed authority. Of course, water moats came with side effects. Mosquitoes rejoiced. Local frogs received an unexpected housing upgrade. The castle's laundry staff discovered that retrieving laundry blown into the moat required bravery and prayer. And every so often, someone tried to wade across and learned the universal truth. Mud does not care about human dignity. Still, moats worked. They discouraged attackers, slowed siege engines, and prevented casual strolls toward the walls. A moat made invading a castle feel less like a confident march and more like an obstacle course designed by someone who hated you personally. So naturally, moats stayed even after the emergency ended, even after warfare changed. Even after cannons made walls questionable and moats borderline pointless, lords kept them because they looked impressive. Some emptied the water and turned their moats into gardens, menageries, or extremely inconvenient walking paths, but they refused to fill them in. A temporary ditch dug in panic became one of the most iconic defensive features in medieval architecture. All because one noble long ago shouted, "Just dig a hole," and everyone else decided the hole was beautiful. In the medieval world, taverns were the social glue holding communities together. They were the newspaper, the therapy office, the entertainment center, and occasionally the place where you woke up wondering whose boots you were wearing. And because taverns were such essential meeting points, they invented a concept modern humans know very well, the tab. But medieval tabs were never meant to be long-term. The idea was simple. You forgot your coins or you didn't feel like stumbling home to fetch them, so you told the tavern keeper, "Put it on my account." A harmless arrangement. Temporary, friendly, and intended to be settled at the end of the week. Except medieval people had the same self-control as modern people staring at a cheesecake. The tab kept growing. At first it was a few Alish, then a dinner, then another ale because someone insulted your chicken, then a round for everyone because that joke you told was definitely worth celebrating. Soon you owed so much that paying it off required divine intervention or a highly profitable harvest season. The tavern keeper, of course, tracked all of this with alarming precision. While medieval accounting in general could be described as improvised optimism, tavern books were ironclad. He might forget who owned the sheep wandering outside, but he absolutely remembered that you owed him 11 Alish, 3 meals, and 1 broken stool from last Thursday. When a customer died, which in medieval times happened with cheerful frequency, the tavern keeper simply transferred the tab to the next of kin. Medieval inheritance law was merciless. Land passed to heirs, debts passed to heirs, and yes, the tavern tab passed to heirs. Imagine inheriting your great-uncle's bar bill and thinking, I wasn't even born when he bought this soup. Some families carried tavern debts like cursed heirlooms. A young man would declare, "I am finally free to start my life," only for the tavern keeper to appear like a medieval tax spirit and say, "Actually, you owe 6 gallons of ale your grandfather drank during the famine of 1321. Tavern tabs became so entrenched that some villages treated them like unofficial credit systems. People traded, negotiated, and even bragged about their tabs. The most impressive villages owed enough to mortgage a small castle. In the end, the medieval tab lasted because it solved a problem everyone had: wanting ale now and responsibility later. It was a temporary convenience that became a generational institution, a medieval tradition born from thirst and perfected by procrastination. In the medieval winter, survival required creativity, determination, and occasionally the willingness to let a chicken sleep in your living room. The original idea was simple and practical. During the coldest months, when temperatures could drop lower than a nobleman's empathy, peasants brought their chickens indoors temporarily to prevent them from freezing to death. After all, a living chicken produced eggs, but a frozen one produced only disappointment. This was meant to be a seasonal arrangement. 3 months of winter together, then everyone politely returning to their designated living spaces. But medieval humans quickly discovered an unexpected benefit. Chickens indoors meant eggs indoors. No more stumbling out into a snowstorm just to see if a hen felt generous. The hen was now sitting by the hearth like a grumpy, feathered roommate, warming herself and silently judging everyone. Soon chickens claimed corners of cottages, rearranged straw piles, and strutted around with the confidence of beings who knew they were essential to household survival. The peasants accepted this. They were used to sharing their homes with smoke, tools, children, and occasionally livestock. So, a chicken or 3 barely registered as unusual. The problem arose when winter ended, and the chickens didn't want to leave. By spring, many hens had grown accustomed to luxury living. Why go back to the drafty coop when the cottage offered warmth, companionship, and unrestricted access to fallen crumbs? It didn't take long for peasants to realize that their temporary winter guests were now permanent tenants. Cottage life reorganized itself around them. Families stepped carefully to avoid crushing a half-asleep hen. Meals involved chewing chickens away from the table with the same tired sigh used on misbehaving toddlers. Conversations were frequently interrupted by enthusiastic clucking, and every household developed that one chicken who believed she was in charge. Chickens became part of the domestic soundtrack, the crackle of the hearth, the quiet hum of conversation, and the occasional triumphant cackle announcing an egg delivery. Medieval visitors barely noticed. After all, their own cottages were equally chaotic. If anything, a chicken indoors was a sign of prosperity because it wasn't dead. Over generations, the practice became normalized. What began as a crisis measure transformed into a charmingly chaotic tradition. Cottages became micro-farms and chickens became unofficial members of the family. In the end, medieval people didn't just adapt to chickens indoors, they embraced it. And honestly, the chickens did too. In the early medieval world, most people didn't have surnames. Villages were small, nobody moved anywhere, and everyone knew everyone else's business anyway. If you said John, everyone knew which John you meant, usually from the context of scandal. But as populations grew, medieval society encountered a troubling problem. There were too many Johns. The solution: temporary nicknames. Just a quick descriptor to tell people apart. John the baker, John the tall, John the quiet, John who smells slightly of fish. These labels were meant to be casual, flexible, expendable, used for a season, maybe a lifetime, but certainly not for all eternity. And then medieval bureaucracy entered the chat. When governments started recording taxes, property, and legal disputes, scribes needed identifiers. They couldn't write John, the one who lives kind of near the well, but not too close because of that incident. So, they used whatever nickname the community already had for him. Once written down, the name became official. And once it became official, it became hereditary. Which is why hundreds of years later, completely normal families walk around with names like Short, Long, Armstrong, Swift, Brown, Cook, Fisher, and Baker. Names that began as quick labels, shouted across muddy streets, and never meant to be immortal. Some medieval nicknames were flattering. Most were not. Imagine being called John the Bald for one winter while your hair was growing back, only for your descendants 500 years later to sign checks as Mr. Bald. Or consider William Crooked Nose, whose family desperately wished medieval scribes had taken the day off when that name was recorded. Then there are surnames like Folks, Stout, Pepper, Fox, and Goodman, names that hint at personality traits, professions, local jokes, or unfortunate events no one in the modern family remembers but definitely happened. The funniest cases are the surnames that freeze a single moment in time, like a medieval screenshot. Someone once slipped in the mud or chased a goat or burned a batch of bread, and now their descendants are forever known by the fallout of that moment. That's not a surname. That's cosmic comedy. By the late Middle Ages, surnames were locked in. Temporary nicknames had transformed into full-blown identities. The medieval world took a fleeting joke and made it genealogical destiny. And honestly, that might be the most medieval thing of all. Medieval Europe did not plan its road system. Planning implies intention, foresight, meetings, diagrams, and at least one person saying, "Let's not do this terribly." Medieval roads, on the other hand, happened because enough people walked through the same muddy field until a trench appeared and everyone collectively decided, "Ah, yes, this is the road." Now, originally, these paths weren't meant to last. They were temporary shortcuts created during seasonal changes. Farmers taking a quicker route during harvest. Shepherds guiding animals around flooded meadows. Merchants trying to avoid whatever wolf lived near the main path. These routes were improvised, accidental, and deeply, profoundly unsuitable for long-term use. But medieval society had a rule. If something worked once, it would be used forever. Permanence by laziness. Soon, entire communities adopted these muddy trenches as their main roads. No paving, no gravel, not even an attempt to flatten the ground. Just a line of churned earth carved by human feet, horse hooves, cartwheels, and the occasional confused goose. And then it rained. Rain was the mortal enemy of medieval travel. A pleasant drizzle could transform a road into a swamp, and a proper storm could turn it into something resembling bread dough. Carts got stuck. Horses sank. People lost shoes so frequently that finding footwear in the mud was basically a neighborhood hobby. Medieval chroniclers describe roads as deep, treacherous, or impossible, which are polite ways of saying, "Do not attempt unless you enjoy suffering." Yet no one fixed them. Why? Because maintenance required effort and effort required organization. And organization required someone being in charge. Medieval villages were masters at avoiding all three. The crown occasionally declared, "Henceforth all towns shall repair their roads." And towns responded with the medieval equivalent of nodding politely and doing nothing. Eventually, these temporary mud trails became so established that maps recorded them. Merchants relied on them. Armies marched along them. and no one remembered they weren't supposed to be permanent. Travelers describe journeys as spiritual trials, which is historians speak for, "I never want to see mud again." By the time proper paving arrived centuries later, some roads had been muddy for so long that people practically considered the mud sacred. It had heritage, tradition, personality. A temporary shortcut had become a medieval highway, and every medieval traveler suffered for it. Medieval battles were chaotic, loud, dusty, and full of people wearing helmets that made it impossible to tell friend from enemy. So, commanders developed a simple, temporary solution. A flag, a bright, recognizable piece of cloth held high above the carnage to say, "If you're on this side, don't stab anyone standing under this banner." That was it. The flag was never meant to be anything more than a practical battlefield marker. No symbolism, no pride, no national identity, just a medieval version of Team Jersey, but significantly flappier. Yet, as usual, medieval people refused to let a temporary idea remain temporary. A flag that had survived one battle, usually by pure luck, was considered heroic. Soldiers adored it. Commanders insisted on using the same one again. And soon the temporary banner turned into an emotional support cloth that people were willing to die for. And if the flag got lost in battle, that was a national tragedy. Chroniclers described it with the same sorrow they used for natural disasters. The loss of a flag was like losing a beloved relative, except the relative was made of linen and had definitely never contributed to family gatherings. Then came the upgrades. Nobles began decorating their flags with symbols, animals, mottos, and colors that were supposed to inspire the troops, though half the soldiers were illiterate and the other half colorblind due to living in the Middle Ages. Still, the banners grew more elaborate, turning into works of art too precious for the battlefield. Naturally, they kept bringing them to battles anyway. Some flags gained legendary status simply because they survived. Imagine a scrap of cloth that made it through 2 wars, 3 sieges, and 1 extremely dramatic thunderstorm. People started attributing divine protection to it. "This banner cannot fall," they cried, as if it were the medieval equivalent of plot armor. And with every battle it survived, its reputation inflated like a medieval ego. Over time, these battlefield banners outgrew their original purpose. They became symbols of kingdoms, peoples, cultures, and identities. What began as a temporary "don't stab us" indicator transformed into a defining emblem of entire nations. Centuries later, people look at national flags with reverence, imagining deep philosophical meaning behind every stripe and symbol. The truth: most of them started because someone needed a big visible stick to tell soldiers where not to swing their swords. In medieval Europe, a feast day was originally a rare treat, an occasional celebration to honor a new saint, commemorate a miracle, or distract everyone from the fact that winter had lasted 7 months and morale was low. These feast days were supposed to be temporary, occasional little sparks of joy in a world where plumbing was a myth and bread was considered mildly exciting. But medieval people quickly discovered something important. Feast days were significantly more enjoyable than work days. The moment a village celebrated one feast day successfully, meaning there was singing, ale, meat, and only a minimal number of fights, everyone said, "We should absolutely do this again." Other villages heard about it and said, "Why don't we have a feast day like that?" And the church, which loved a good saint, kept officially approving more. Soon, the medieval calendar resembled a child's notebook, packed, chaotic, and containing celebrations no one remembered assigning. What began as a handful of holy days ballooned into an overwhelming schedule of feasts, vigils, saints' birthdays, saints' deaths, saints' cousins' miracles, and local traditions that made perfect sense to villagers, but zero sense to historians. Some towns celebrated the feast of the saint, who allegedly chased away a plague. Others honored the saint who stopped a cow from escaping. One village even held a feast for a man who did something good with bread, though the details were tragically lost to time. The result was glorious chaos. On paper, medieval peasants were supposed to work most days of the year. In reality, depending on the region, up to 1/3 of the calendar was consumed by feasts, half-feasts, pre-fasts, and post-feasts. You might wake up planning to harvest barley only to discover it was Saint Someone or Other's Day, and thus by the sacred laws of tradition you were required to socialize and drink instead. Even authorities complained, but not enough to stop the trend. Kings sometimes tried to reduce the number of feast days for productivity only to attend them enthusiastically when invited. Priests tried to enforce moderation and ended up hosting the most elaborate celebrations. Hypocrisy was part of the charm. By the late Middle Ages, Europe was drowning in feast days, and no one could remember which ones were originally temporary celebrations. A single event meant to lift village spirits had evolved into a permanent excuse to stop working. And medieval people, being geniuses in their own chaotic way, embraced it wholeheartedly. Medieval hairstyles were not designed with subtlety or restraint. They were created by people who woke up one morning, made a questionable grooming decision, and accidentally launched a regional trend. Many of the most iconic medieval hairstyles, the ones we see in manuscripts and wonder why, began as temporary experiments, jokes, or acts of desperation. Take the infamous tuncha, for example. Monks shaved the top of their heads supposedly to symbolize humility. Realistically, it probably began because someone made a hair-cutting mistake, panicked, and declared, "It's holy now." Instead of correcting the mistake, monasteries adopted it for centuries, producing thousands of holy men who looked permanently startled. Then there were the shaved foreheads worn by fashionable noble women. This started as a short-lived attempt to create the illusion of a larger, more elegant forehead, considered the height of beauty. A single noble woman probably tried it as a joke or to hide a botched haircut, and suddenly half the continent was plucking and shaving their foreheads as if auditioning to be medieval light bulbs. Temporary fad? Absolutely. Did it last 100 years? Tragically, yes. Other trends spread through pure social pressure. Imagine a duke shows up to court with a ridiculous haircut, two tufts sticking out like horns, or hair shaped into a cone, or curls so elaborate they require architectural support. People laugh, thinking it's satire, but the duke insists it's fashion. And because he's powerful, everyone reluctantly imitates him. Within months, the entire noble class is walking around looking like they lost a bet with a sculptor. And then there were the practical disasters that became fashion statements. A knight returns from battle, helmet hair in total ruin, tufts sticking out at odd angles. Instead of admitting defeat, he announces, "This is my new style." Suddenly, the other knights admire it. Before long, they're all styling their hair to resemble someone who fought a windmill and lost. The most fascinating part, once a hairstyle took hold, even if it began as a joke, it became tradition. Manuscript illustrations immortalized it. Courtiers defended it. Artists exaggerated it. And medieval society clung to it with the same stubborn determination it showed toward every other temporary idea. Thus, hairstyles that should have lasted a weekend instead lasted decades. All because medieval Europeans refused to admit something looked ridiculous. In a world without mirrors, bad hair days became culture. In the Middle Ages, cities didn't grow because of thoughtful planning. They grew because people showed up, built something temporary, and then never left. What began as a collection of seasonal huts, quick shelters thrown together by traveling workers, merchants, or farmers, slowly mutated into entire neighborhoods, usually without anyone explicitly deciding it should happen. It always started the same way. A group of workers arrived to repair a castle wall, harvest a big field, or construct a church that would take approximately 14 lifetimes to complete. They needed somewhere to sleep, so they built small simple structures, wooden huts, lintos, tents, anything that vaguely resembled shelter and didn't collapse immediately in the wind. These were supposed to be temporary, use it for a few weeks, then dismantle it and go home, except no one dismantled anything. Maybe the job took longer. Maybe the workers were lazy. Maybe the weather got bad and the hut felt surprisingly cozy. Regardless of the reason, medieval workers did what medieval workers always did. They shrugged and stayed. Meanwhile, more people arrived. Merchants showed up to sell bread and ale to the workers. Their stalls needed shelter too, so they added more huts. Laborers brought families who built slightly sturdier huts. Then came the blacksmith, who followed workers anywhere like a medieval food truck. Before long, the temporary camp looked suspiciously like a village. At this point, the local lord would wander by, notice a cluster of buildings he definitely didn't authorize, and announce, "Excellent, a new district. I shall be raising rent." And with that declaration, the once temporary structures gained instant legitimacy. Over time, these accidental neighborhoods expanded. Wooden huts turned into timber-framed homes. Dirt paths became muddy roads. A well was dug. A tavern appeared. Because medieval people never built anything without immediately adding a tavern. By the time anyone realized a permanent settlement had formed, families had already lived there for generations. Some of Europe's most famous medieval districts began exactly this way. Unauthorized pop-up suburbs created by tired workers who did not feel like traveling back home. Urban planners today look at medieval cities and ask, "Why does this street twist like a panicked snake?" The answer is simple. It was never meant to be a street. It was the path between two temporary huts that overstayed their welcome by about 800 years. In medieval life, temporary shelters didn't disappear, they evolved, and sometimes they accidentally became cities. Mary Tudor entered the world on a cold February morning in 1516, the long-awaited child of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. She wasn't the son her father had prayed for, but she was healthy, bright-eyed, and startlingly intelligent for an infant who was barely expected to survive her first winter. Almost immediately, ambassadors wrote about her with the kind of astonishment usually reserved for prodigies. She learned Latin before most noble children learned table manners, played the virginals with practiced elegance, and carried herself with a calm dignity that made even adults straighten their posture around her. For a brief moment, she lived the life of a cherished princess in a court that adored the idea of a Tudor heir, even if she wasn't male, but because she was Henry VIII's daughter. Her early years were built on foundations destined to crack. Mary worshipped her mother, a woman of deep faith and steady resolve, who raised her with a sense of duty and piety that Mary would carry all her life. She also adored her father, who at first openly doted on her, proudly showing her off to visiting dignitaries, as if she were living proof of divine approval. Little Mary had no idea that the same man who lifted her into the air, smiling, would one day strip her of her title and force her to swear her mother's marriage invalid. As Mary grew, so did Henry's anxiety about securing a male heir. Catherine's pregnancies ended in heartbreak after heartbreak, and Henry, never a man to accept misfortune without assigning blame, began to look for theological loopholes and political escape routes. The shadows lengthened around Mary's childhood as her father's attention drifted to and Bullen, and the court grew tense with rumors of an annulment. Mary was old enough to understand when her world collapsed. She watched her mother exiled from court, barred from seeing her own daughter. She watched and rise in her place. And she learned painfully early that love at the Tudor court was conditional, especially the love of a king. By the time Mary reached adolescence, the once celebrated princess had become a political inconvenience, a child caught between her devotion to her mother and the wrath of her father. And although she survived it, the wound never truly healed. It shaped her faith, her fears, and the kind of queen she would one day become. Mary Tudor's fall from royal grace was not a single moment. It was a slow, bruising descent that stretched over years, each step more humiliating than the last. When Henry VIII broke from Rome to Mary and Bullen, Mary became collateral damage in a political transformation she had no power to resist. One proclamation declared her no longer the Lady Princess, but simply Lady Mary, a title carefully chosen to remind everyone that the king now considered her illegitimate. It was the kind of blow designed not only to alter her status, but to pierce her identity. The court, which once bowed to her, now treated her with a stiff politeness, meant for someone who mattered only in theory. Worst of all, she was forbidden to see her mother, Catherine of Aragon, the one anchor in her storm of uncertainty. Henry and Anne understood perfectly that separating mother and daughter was a punishment far more effective than any tower cell. Letters between Mary and Catherine were smuggled like contraband, each line a mixture of devotion, despair, and stubborn courage. When Catherine insisted Mary hold firm in recognizing her as the rightful queen, Mary obeyed, even though doing so placed her in direct rebellion against her father and stepmother, and for her part saw Mary as a threat, a symbol of a rival marriage that refused to vanish. Mary's presence reminded the court that not everyone accepted Elizabeth, Anne's newborn daughter, as the true heir. Some contemporaries even reported and wishing Mary dead, though whether this was literal hatred or court gossip embroidered for drama remains debated. What's certain is that Mary feared and deeply. The two women circled each other in a political Cold War that neither could escape. Then the blow Mary had dreaded came in 1536, her mother's death. Catherine died isolated, weakened, and unwavering in her faith. For Mary, the grief was mixed with guilt. Guilt for not being able to reach her, to comfort her, to receive one last blessing. Mary's world shrank again, leaving her alone without the one person who loved her without condition. By the time Anne Boleyn fell later that same year, executed after her spectacular collapse, Mary felt little triumph. Court factions begged her to reconcile with her father, to sign a document acknowledging herself as a bastard and her parents' marriage invalid. It was a moment of cruel irony, redemption through surrender. Mary signed not because she believed it, never that, but because survival sometimes demanded surrender. Mary Tudor, already tempered by loss, chose to live. With Anne gone and Jane Seymour rising in her place, Mary Tudor finally saw a crack of light in the walls that had closed around her for years. Jane, unlike Anne, had genuine sympathy for Mary's suffering and worked carefully, sometimes quietly, sometimes boldly, to restore peace between father and daughter. It took diplomacy, persuasion, and the relentless nudging of Charles V's ambassadors, but eventually Henry VIII relented. He allowed Mary to return to court, though on his terms, under his conditions, and only after she had signed the humiliating submission declaring her parents' marriage unlawful. But Mary, desperate for survival and exhausted by grief, took the deal. Her return to court was bittersweet. Henry greeted her with warmth, even affection, as if the years of estrangement had been nothing more than a family spat. That was Henry's style. He expected others to forget instantly and completely the pain he inflicted. Mary was expected to smile, to obey, to slip back into the role of the beautiful Tudor daughter. She did all of that, yet inside she carried the scars of abandonment, humiliation, and a spiritual conviction that she had betrayed her mother's memory. She tried, however, to move forward. Jane Seymour helped her feel welcome. Mary adored Jane more than any of her father's wives, because Jane treated her not as a symbol or a problem to be solved, but as a young woman who had survived far too much. For a moment, Mary experienced something resembling family life. She also doted on the child Jane gave birth to, the future Edward VI. Holding her baby brother, Mary allowed herself to imagine that their repaired family might endure, but stability at the Tudor court was an illusion that never lasted. Jane Seymour died days after childbirth, leaving Mary bereft once again. Her father remarried 3 more times, and each new queen represented a new political climate Mary had to navigate. Anne of Cleves was harmless. Catherine Howard, dangerously chaotic. Catherine Parr, intelligent and kind, but deeply entangled in Protestant reform, something Mary viewed with horror. Though restored, Mary walked on eggshells. Her Catholic faith was non-negotiable, and Henry's shifting religious policies constantly threatened her position. She obeyed outwardly, but never softened her beliefs. She was tolerated, not trusted, welcomed, yet watched. In truth, Mary never again felt truly safe. Her father's approval could turn to wrath in an instant, and as she approached adulthood, one thing became unmistakably clear. Her future would depend on her ability to survive the political storms still gathering over England. When Henry VIII died in 1547, Mary Tudor was 31 years old, an age by Tudor standards dangerously close to permanent spinsterhood. She had lived through her father's 6 marriages, religious upheaval, humiliating reversals of status, and enough emotional trauma to crush a lesser person. Now, the crown passed to her 9-year-old half-brother, Edward VI, whose radical Protestant advisors viewed Mary's unwavering Catholicism as both a political threat and a personal affront. Mary found herself suddenly vulnerable again. Despite being the king's sister and Henry's eldest surviving child, she was powerless under Edward's regency. Her properties were monitored, her mass services prohibited, and her household infiltrated with spies. Edward's council pressured her relentlessly to abandon Catholic worship, something she refused again and again, even when it placed her on the edge of treason. This resistance was not stubbornness for its own sake. Mary saw faith as her anchor, the one part of her identity no political pressure could take. The more they tried to bend her, the more she stiffened. Her relationship with Edward deteriorated rapidly. He saw her defiance as rebellion. She saw his demands as persecution. Their final meetings became bitter exchanges between a dying boy king and a sister who understood that the moment he passed, the realm would be thrown into chaos. Edward's death in 1553 triggered exactly that. The Duke of Northumberland attempted a desperate coup by placing Lady Jane Grey, Edward's Protestant cousin, on the throne. It was a gamble that depended on Mary being too isolated, unpopular, or frightened to challenge it. But Mary Tudor had survived far worse than political scheming. She fled, gathered supporters, and within days amassed an army larger than Northumberland's. Even Protestants joined her, not out of devotion to Catholicism but because Mary was Henry VIII's rightful heir. She represented legitimacy in a kingdom exhausted by instability. Mary's march to London became a swelling movement, a declaration that the Tudor line would not be displaced. When Jane Grey's short-lived reign collapsed after only 9 days, Mary entered the capital as both a victorious claimant and a woman burdened by a lifetime of betrayals. Yet amid the triumph, she felt the weight of ruling alone. She had no husband, no children, and no guarantee her fragile claim would survive the shifting tides of politics. Becoming queen was not the culmination of her story. It was the beginning of her most difficult chapter. Mary Tudor's accession in 1553 was nothing short of miraculous, an unexpected triumph in a world that had repeatedly tried to sideline her. Crowds flooded the streets to welcome her. Bells rang, bonfires blazed, and for a moment England seemed genuinely united behind its new queen. After decades of humiliation and political marginalization, Mary finally stood where she believed in her heart believed God intended her to be. But a crown did not erase old wounds, nor guarantee loyalty. Her first challenge was exactly what she expected: religion. Mary was determined to restore Catholicism, not as a gentle suggestion but as her life's mission. She believed God had preserved her for this purpose. Her childhood trauma, her mother's suffering, and her own disgrace all formed a narrative of divine purpose in her mind. This conviction made her strong, but also inflexible. Mary understood reform not as political debate but as moral emergency. The kingdom must return to Rome, and she would be the instrument of that correction. However, even before she could address religious policy, she faced an equally urgent and deeply personal issue: the succession. She was 37, childless, and unmarried. Every advisor, ambassador, and court insider knew that without an heir, Mary's Catholic restoration would die with her. That reality terrified her council. If she failed to produce a child, her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth would inherit, and the entire religious direction of the realm would reverse overnight. To Mary, the solution was obvious. She needed to marry quickly and strategically. But who she should marry was a matter that split the kingdom in two. Some urged an English nobleman, someone who could calm fears of foreign dominance. But Mary, shaped by her mother's Spanish lineage and her own devout Catholicism, looked toward a powerful Catholic match, one capable of strengthening her reform and securing her realm. Enter Philip of Spain, son of Emperor Charles V, a man whose dynastic pedigree could bolster Mary's legitimacy and perhaps secure that longed-for child. To Mary, Philip represented stability, faith, and the hope of finally building the family life she had been denied for decades. But to her subjects, he represented something far more menacing: foreign rule, Spanish influence, and the possibility that England would become a satellite of the Habsburg Empire. Mary was crowned queen, yes, but as she prepared to marry, she would learn just how quickly public celebration could turn into suspicion, resentment, and rebellion. Mary Tudor believed her marriage to Philip of Spain would heal England's fractures, secure the Catholic faith, and finally give her the child she longed for. In her mind, this union wasn't merely political. It was providential. She saw Philip as a partner chosen not just by diplomacy, but by God himself. Yet the moment news of the proposed marriage reached the English public, the atmosphere changed. Excitement over Mary's coronation evaporated almost overnight, replaced by deep suspicion and, in some corners, outright panic. England had a long memory, and it remembered what happened when foreign powers entangled themselves with English crowns. Philip wasn't just any foreign prince. He was a Habsburg, heir to the vast Spanish Empire and part of a dynasty known for dominating Europe. Ordinary Englishmen imagined themselves soon governed by Spanish officials, taxed to fund Spanish wars, and dragged into conflicts that had nothing to do with their island. Even nobles who supported Mary's reign balked at the idea of Philip gaining any real influence. They feared England becoming a mere appendage of Spain. And their fears weren't entirely irrational. Mary, however, refused to bend. She trusted Philip, trusted Spain, and believed that a strong Catholic husband was essential for a strong Catholic throne. The more resistance she faced, the more stubbornly she clung to the plan. She wasn't simply marrying for love or companionship, though both mattered to her more than she admitted. She was marrying to secure the Tudor line and her mother's legacy. But the country saw it differently. In early 1554, the simmering discontent exploded into open revolt, Wyatt's Rebellion, led by Sir Thomas Wyatt. It was a desperate attempt to stop the Spanish marriage and, depending on the faction, replace Mary with her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth. Though the rebellion ultimately failed, it shook Mary to her core. She had expected political opposition, not armed men marching toward London with the intent to control or depose her. Mary responded with a firmness that would later help build her notorious reputation. She delivered a bold speech at Guildhall, declaring she would die a queen rather than abandon her rightful authority. It was one of the most powerful moments in Tudor history, displaying a courage even her enemies respected. But the rebellion left scars. Trust evaporated. Elizabeth fell under suspicion, and Mary learned a painful truth. Her subjects did not share her vision of salvation through marriage. Still, she proceeded. In July 1554, Philip arrived in England, and Mary walked toward a future she believed would secure her throne, unaware that it would instead deepen her sorrow. When Philip of Spain finally arrived in England in July 1554, Mary Tudor was overwhelmed with anticipation. She had imagined a partnership built on shared faith, mutual respect, and perhaps, if God willed it, affection strong enough to bless them with an heir. After years of loneliness, political isolation, and emotional deprivation, Mary longed for companionship as much as she needed a successor. She approached the marriage with sincerity and hope, believing Philip would be both a loving husband and a powerful ally. But Philip saw this union very differently. At 27, Philip was 11 years younger than Mary. He had been married before, widowed, and raised in the intensely political environment of the Habsburg court. To him, marriage was a dynastic duty, not a source of romance. The wedding was something he endured, not embraced. Contemporary accounts suggest he was courteous and respectful, but never emotionally invested. His letters to his father, Emperor Charles V, made it clear he viewed the marriage as a strategic obligation rather than a personal joy. Mary, however, misread his politeness as warmth. She was enchanted by him, his regal bearing, his piety, his continental sophistication. She fell genuinely, perhaps desperately, in love. For a woman who had spent her life deprived of affection, Philip's presence must have felt like a long-awaited affirmation of her worth. For Philip, however, England felt cold, provincial, and foreign. He disliked the climate, the politics, and the suspicion that followed him everywhere. He couldn't speak English, and he found the English nobility prickly and hostile. Worst of all, he understood that Parliament had deliberately limited his authority to prevent him from wielding real power. Mary gave him her heart. Philip gave England a polite, distant nod. Even so, he performed his duties. Publicly, he stood beside her as king consort. Privately, he remained restrained, cautious, and detached. Mary's affection grew stronger the more he withdrew, creating an emotional imbalance that would haunt their marriage. Yet, in late 1554, something remarkable happened. Mary's menstruation stopped. She felt swelling, nausea, and movement within her belly. Physicians confirmed what she longed to hear. She was pregnant, or so everyone believed. For Mary, It was the culmination of every prayer she had ever whispered. For Philip, it meant potential success for a marriage he barely tolerated. For England, it sparked hope and dread. None of them knew the truth. This pregnancy would become one of the most tragic allusions in Tudor history. By the winter of 1554 to 1555, Mary Tudor was certain she was pregnant. Her stomach swelled, her breasts grew tender. She felt the familiar signs every midwife recognized. Court physicians confirmed Mary's pregnancy, and England rejoiced, believing a Catholic heir was finally coming. For Mary, it felt like divine reward after years of suffering and humiliation. Her joy was real, her symptoms were real, but the pregnancy was not. Historians today believe she experienced pseudocyesis, a condition triggered by extreme stress and desire for motherhood. Her body mimicked pregnancy perfectly, fooling even trained doctors. Preparations began. A nursery, cradle, letters, even debates about Philip ruling if she died in childbirth. Philip softened toward her, not out of love but because a successful pregnancy meant political success. Mary retreated into confinement, but days became weeks, weeks became months, and no child came. Rumors spread, hope collapsed, and Mary suffered unbearable humiliation and grief. Philip returned to Europe, the marriage grew colder, and Mary felt abandoned once again by life and love. Her rule grew darker in the eyes of her people as she enforced Catholic uniformity, leading to what later generations called the Marian burnings. Mary believed she was saving souls. Her subjects saw fear, flames, and oppression. In 1557, she again became convinced she was pregnant, repeating the same heartbreaking cycle. This time, her health rapidly declined, likely from serious gynecological illness. Political losses, including Calais, crushed her spirit. By late 1558, she was bedridden, aware she was dying, and forced to name Elizabeth as successor. A decision that meant everything she tried to restore would soon be undone. Mary died at 42, lonely, childless, and remembered as Bloody Mary, a label that hides the wounded, devout, emotionally exhausted woman behind the crown. Across another age, Alexander the Great faced his own impossible dream: to unite a massive empire not through force alone but through culture and marriage. Seeking harmony between Macedonian and Persian worlds, he organized the mass wedding at Susa, pairing dozens of his officers with Persian noblewomen and himself marrying into Persia's royal bloodline. The ceremony dazzled the senses and symbolized unity, but beneath the gold and music lay deep division. Macedonians felt their identity threatened. Persians felt conquered beneath polite ceremony. The marriages created resentment instead of harmony, and soon the mutiny at Opis revealed how fragile Alexander's vision truly was. Alexander wept and begged his soldiers for loyalty, creating symbolic brotherhoods and pressing forward with his dream. But unity could not be engineered through ritual alone. The empire remained stretched between an idealistic king and a people unwilling or unable to share his vision. In both stories, Mary and Alexander pursued faith, love, and unity with everything they had, and were broken by realities they could not control. Those who mastered it returned transformed, moving with a predator's quiet confidence, no longer startled by darkness, no longer shaken by sudden noises. They understood that fear was not something to eliminate, but something to dominate. In the phalanx, this training would make them immovable. As scouts, it made them ghosts. As enforcers of Spartan control, it made them terrifying. But there remained one final trial, the culmination of everything the Agag and Crypia demanded. A task that required stealth, survival, loyalty, and the absolute suppression of fear. The final test was a hunt, and this time the prey could fight back. The last trial of a Spartan youth was never written in laws, never formally acknowledged, and rarely spoken of even among Spartans themselves. It existed in the shadows, known only through hints, fragments, and the uneasy silence of those who passed it. This trial was the culmination of everything the Agog and the Crypta sought to create. A soldier who belonged wholly to the state, who could kill without trembling, and who had severed the final ties between himself and the softness of ordinary human life. The final test was a hunt. Unlike earlier tasks, this hunt had no instructors lurking nearby, no staged obstacles, and no symbolic targets. A youth was given only a cloak, a dagger, and a vague directive. Eliminate a designated threat to Sparta. Most often, the target was a helot suspected of rebellion, someone strong, capable, and dangerous. This was not an execution of the weak. It was a contest between predator and prey. The boy had to track his quarry across fields, forests, and ravines, relying on skills honed through years of deprivation and training. He had to observe habits, anticipate routes, and choose the perfect moment to strike. A sloppy kill meant death. Silence was essential. A single scream or misstep could alert other helots and turn the hunter into the hunted. This was the moment that separated boys from warriors and warriors from ghosts. If the youth succeeded, he returned to Sparta without celebration. No ceremony greeted him. No public honor was bestowed. Instead, he was met with nods from the elders, small, grim acknowledgments that he had crossed the final threshold. He had taken a life not in the chaos of battle, but in cold, solitary precision. Sparta believed this forged, unbreakable mental discipline. A man who had killed in silence would never lose his composure in war. But if he failed, if he hesitated, fled, or was detected, his fate was sealed. Some were killed by the helots they stalked. Others were quietly removed from Spartan society, erased from memory. Sparta had no use for half-made warriors. For those who survived, the final test marked the end of childhood and the beginning of service. They returned to the barracks as full Spartiate men inducted into a collective identity that demanded absolute loyalty. Their lives were now instruments of policy, war, and state survival. No family, no fear, no self. Only Sparta. The secret rites of Spartan youth were never meant to create human beings. They were meant to create weapons. Weapons that did not question, hesitate, or break. And in that mission, the Agoga succeeded with chilling perfection.